This Republican Party of Jefferson was the new wave of the century, and the Americans embraced what is now called, well, what today we would call conservatism, but this was 19th century liberalism. That meant small government and the emphasis on liberties as the ideological backing of the party itself, right? So the Republicans were 19th century liberals, small government, and the emphasis on the protection of individual liberties. And again, today you guys have a conservative party that tends to voice that as its ideological backing. All right, so how does Jefferson become President of the United States? We already saw Adams' administration is in crisis. The XYZ affair, Jay's Treaty, and the Alien and Sedition Acts, all making it look like the Federalists are trying to become tyrannical, basically. So in the 1800 campaign, Jefferson was going to win. He had lots of supporters, but I just want to show you that it was a brutal campaign nonetheless. Democracies tend to be mudslinging affairs, and just to illustrate what Jefferson's critics were saying about him, three things basically: that he had robbed a widow and her son of their trust fund, that he had had mulatto children with his slave. Sally Hemings is who it will come to the fore to be in the future, and historians have looked into that. And he was accused of being an atheist, somebody who didn't believe in God at all. Jefferson actually was a deist, and that means that's an Enlightenment thinker's Christian religion. So he was actually a Christian, but nonetheless, deism brought a warning to most people, I guess, some people who wanted to say, well, that's basically without God if you don't follow one of the traditional churches in the Christian religion. Now, don't forget that the United States is very innovative in the Christian religion, and so the Great Awakening that you read about last unit, and then there will be one in the future too, a second Great Awakening. And those Great Awakenings gave birth to different Christian sects, of which deism is not really any different than that, right? So this, in spite of all of this mudslinging campaign, Jefferson will win. And there's always the big question, wow, this was a revolution in 1800. A revolution in the parties in control of government. So perhaps not the government itself, at least didn't overthrow the Constitution, but it brought into the presidency a person who, at least in his rhetoric, had a new way of interpreting the Constitution. And you should remember back to the debate over the U.S. Bank between Hamilton and Jefferson. And Jefferson argued for strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution. That means he would not do anything outside of the purview of the actual words of the Constitution. All right, so this was a transfer of power, and it went about relatively peacefully, and that's important in their day and age, because changes in governance didn't always do that. This republic was something odd in the history of the globe at this time. So the very fact that they could transfer power to a whole new set of people without too much disturbance or any sort of civil war breaking out was just extraordinary. The election came up with a tie between Jefferson and Burr. The reason for this is that there are 4 people on the ballot, and each electoral college person is to give a vote for 2, one for the president, one for the vice president, but just a vote. So it was tradition that one of the electors would withhold a vice presidential vote, right? A vote for the person who was expected to be vice president. In this case, the person that was supposed to do it, apparently, for Burr, did not withhold it. And I'm sorry, I said Burr. Aaron Burr is the name of the politician, and we'll talk a little bit more about him. But that vote was not withheld, so he ended up tying, and I believe the tie was something like 76 to 76, but it was equal for both of them. And so since there was a tie in the election, the House of Representatives would break that tie, and this is the first time that they do that. So the election went to the House of Representatives, and they had to vote for who should be the president and who should be the vice president. And once again, it was a very close vote. Now, we could talk about this more, but the reason to note it is this, that Aaron Burr was always vying for power, and a lot of power, and you'll see that when we get done with this lecture and in your textbook as well, right? All right, so Jefferson wins the presidency by a narrow margin, and Aaron Burr would be the vice president for his first term, and only for the first term, and then he would leave. The tone of Jefferson's administration was set as ascetic and frugal, so Jefferson came on board as a Republican who wanted small government and little spending, right? To keep spending back, to be frugal, and to pay off debts in public affairs. And so you guys have his first inaugural, and he basically says that in his first inaugural. In fact, I think he uses the word frugal. Ascetic means to be unadorned, right? So not buy things or decorate things lavishly, right? So you're going to live with just the bare essence of what you need to live with. Now, during his administration, he will reverse himself on many of the ideas that he had about government, and he will wield government power very strongly, and the federal government power. So he does have some inconsistency in his administration. As far as frugal and aesthetic, if you don't want to look at his personal lifestyle. He was a very educated man in French wines, let's put it that way. And so he did have quite an elegant household in the White House, or not quite the White House yet, but in the house that was the president's house at that time. Anyways, he was inconsistent, and the question is, was that just because he was moderate in trying to run a government with a variety of people and political opinions, and inevitably there was compromise, or was he hypocritical? So I'm not sure he's a very controversial figure, so I can't tell you what historians say in general about him. Some of them criticize his administration for its hypocrisy, and others say that it was moderation, an indication that he was moderate. He did not undo what the Federalists had done. Not the bank, not the debt, not using excise taxes. Oh, sorry, he did take back the excise tax. So there were two exceptions. He would return naturalization to 5 years. So the Alien Act that John Adams had passed was returned to 5 years for naturalization, for the process to becoming a U.S. citizen. And he does repeal the excise tax on whiskey. So he did those two things, but otherwise he left the Federalist innovations as they were in government. In addition, and this is a picture of Dr. Guillotine in front of his instrument itself, which was supposed to be a more humane way of executing people, and that more humane way also drew large crowds to executions, and they were very public. In France in 1793, the French executed over 1,000 people in Paris in 1793-94. That's 2 or 3 a day. It's about a year's time. So the guillotine was a very busy place in Paris at this time. And we saw the other picture, the Americans saw that as barbaric, in spite of the fact of what Dr. Guillotine intended. But the French Revolution had a big impact on the Americans because they had had such an alliance with the French before this time. Jeffersonians and Jefferson himself were big supporters of the French, regardless of the I want to say lawlessness, but the brutality of the French Revolution itself. I mean, they had a massive civil war going on in France in addition to the revolution, so it wasn't quite like the American Revolution. The Federalists supported the revolution, you got to remember, because the French do try to establish a republic. But they supported the early revolution and the limited monarchy that was set up, and they were not supporters of what was called the Reign of Terror in 1793. So the French Revolution and French revolutionaries and our alliance with the French really divided the American public between Jeffersonians and Federalists. So Jefferson presided over a very divided republic, and again, if you look at his first inaugural, you'll see that he is in the very beginning of that speech trying to make amends, or trying to suggest that there is no divide, that ultimately Americans had one interest in mind. And so it's a very interesting speech in that sense. Now let's look at some of the laws that are addressed and new innovations in American constitutionalism, the first of which applies to the Judiciary Act of 1801, which appointed what were called midnight judges. John Adams, as he was leaving the presidential position, his position as president, signed a bunch of judges on in the last days of his term. And that's why they were called midnight judges. They were a last-minute thing he had appointed, and of course he wanted to do this because he wanted Federalists to be in these judiciary positions. Madison was appointed Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, and he was told to give the commissions to these judges that were appointed in the last minutes. And he refused. And so the Marshall Court was faced with a court case, and it's known as Marbury versus Madison. So one of the appointees was a man named Marbury, and he requested that the courts make Madison give the commission to him for the judgeship. The Supreme Court, the Marshall Court is the Supreme Court, dismissed Marbury's case and said that they could not force Madison to give over the commissions to the new judges. But at the same time, they said that an earlier act that allowed John Adams to do this was unconstitutional. So they ruled a law that had been made unconstitutional, and we call this judicial review. So the Marbury versus Madison case established judicial review, which means that the Supreme Court of the United States can decide the constitutionality of a law, and they can rule a law as unconstitutional. And that's one of the first cases to challenge the Supreme Court in the United States, and it's the case that establishes judicial review, which is a very strong power of the United States. In addition to facing a challenge to the justice system, the Jefferson faces a war with the Barbary states, and especially the Pasha in Tripoli, and a war that goes on for about 4 years from 1801 to 1805. He would eventually sign a treaty with the Pasha of Tripoli and pay $60,000 for American sailors that had been kidnapped by the Pasha. Now what's important to this is that this paying off of Barbary states, which are the states in North Africa, along the North African coast in the Mediterranean, and Morocco too, that had been a tradition in Europe. These states would kidnap sailors, and the European nations would pay basically ransom or tribute to the Barbary states and smooth things over, and life would go on and another kidnapping would happen. What Jefferson does, he has paid other ransoms before this, but this time they fight. He America carries on a war against the Barbary States, and he refuses to pay tribute for sailors, American sailors. And finally they negotiate this treaty, and Jefferson agrees to, the last time, a payment of $60,000. And after that, if the Barbary States kidnap U.S. citizens, then they would face war with the United States, right? So $60,000, the captives were returned, the treaty was made, and the treaty is very important that the United States refused to pay again. And Jefferson secures money from the Congress to build 200 ships for the Navy. These were supposed to be the latest in design of naval ships, and they were smaller, quick, and well armed, but they were so small and so light that a bad storm, as we see all the time on the East Coast, came up from the Caribbean and knocked a whole bunch of them out of the ocean and up onto shore and destroyed them. So they were small and light, and they were so small and light that Mother Nature threw them about. He also will purchase the Louisiana Territory, which will double the size of the United States. He does this without congressional okay, so he's going to send diplomats and they're going to buy this, and the Congress hasn't agreed to buying Louisiana, or what is called the Louisiana Territory. Now, the Louisiana Territory is bought from the French, and the French state is in the control of Napoleon at this time. He's waging war on Europe. He's conquering many of the states in Europe, so much so that he controls almost all of the continental powers, and he's at war with England. And he's got some problems, and problems that he would just rather slough off, and he would like some money, right? So a couple of things, right? He's got in Santo Domingo, what is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic, a revolt that was led by the slave Toussaint Louverture. So he's been, fighting that, or at least he's got trouble in the Caribbean. He's got a navy in the Caribbean too that has actually gone to Louisiana, and they got a horrible sickness on board, and many of them died from it. So his navy was depleted by many men at this time as well, at least the navy in the Caribbean. He was, as I said, at war with Britain, and he had many more concerns on the continent of Europe than to worry about the lands in the United States that he had no time to explore. And he needed the money, right? So three things. His navy has got too much trouble in the Caribbean. It's lost a lot of men. War is going on with Britain. He needs money for his campaigns on the European continent. So he agrees to sell the Louisiana Territory. Again, this is going to double the size of the United States for $15 million. And when you find out what that is per acre, it was $4 an acre. So a great deal for the United States, and partly because of the nature of politics in Europe and Napoleon's control of the continent and his crisis in that control. The diplomats, as I said, that went to make the deal with Napoleon did not have the right to make a deal for the entire Louisiana purchase. They had been sent only to buy New Orleans, and so they agreed to the purchase of the whole thing, and it was illegal because the Congress had to give them permission to do that. But nobody's going to argue too much with that deal nonetheless. So they quickly made that deal, and then they brought it back to Congress, and then after the fact, Congress okayed this new and vast territory that was added. This is the territory that the famed Meriwether Lewis and Clark's first name, I forget that. Meriwether Lewis was the scientist in it all. Anyways, Lewis and Clark would travel up the Missouri and the Columbia rivers. And so they went from Missouri, up the Missouri River, and then they had to go across land and connect to the Columbia River, and then they came down the Columbia River out onto the mouth of the Columbia River, which is where Portland is today, and out past near a place that's called Astoria actually today. They were engaged in a scientific study of the whole area that had just been bought from the French. They were also engaged not just in the science of the fauna and flora of the region, but also the cultures of the Native Americans that were up in the region. So they were helped out extraordinarily by a young Sioux woman by the name of Sacagawea. And Sacagawea could speak both English and the Sioux language, and so she was able to help translate for them in many situations. She also was pregnant and had a baby along the way, so lots of interesting things happened personally along the way. This will also open the West, or this part of the West, to trappers and traders, and finally pioneers will follow up on that. So it's the beginning of a movement to the west and into what is called the Oregon Territory, and especially a pioneer explosion into that territory. That would, following Lewis and Clark, would be other explorers, right? So Zebulon Pike explored the area that was called the Great American Desert. It's really a interesting thing, the area that they called the Great American Desert. So they bought this land, these explorers went out, Zebulon Pike, and they said nothing can be grown here. And that area is what is part of Colorado and Kansas and Arkansas and parts of Oklahoma today. It's grasslands. And to their eyes, it looked like you could have nothing grown there. And it's the great wheat-producing region of the United States today. So it wasn't quite the desert that they thought. It also rendered up lots of oil reserves as well. So Zebulon Pike was wrong, but nonetheless he called the region in the Colorado, Kansas, Arkansas, Oklahoma area the Great American Desert. Nebraska is probably in that too. All right. In addition, other trapper traders, mountain men. John Fremont was one of those, and he would establish or explore the region that would become the Oregon Trail. And then he would move into California, and he will be part of the California revolt against Spanish overlordship, I guess I would say. Anyways, he and some followers in the Sacramento area will defeat any Spanish presence there, which wasn't much, and declare a republic in California for 3 weeks, and that's how it becomes known as the Bear Flag Republic. And John Fremont was one of the authors of that, or one of the fighters for that. Finally, in Thomas Jefferson's administration, we have the famed Aaron Burr. Remember, he was a vice president for Jefferson for the first administration, and he engages in lots of efforts to try to gain power or divide the United States up. So he is an interesting character. I label this the Aaron Burr conspiracy. Some of these, it's unclear whether he actually participated in a conspiracy. Other ones, it's a little bit more clear. So let's just look at his background. Again, he was Jefferson's vice president. He was accused of being part of a Federalist plot to separate the New England region from the United States. So it was there was a movement for secession of New England from the United States. Whether Aaron Burr was part of that conspiracy or not is unclear. Nonetheless, Alexander Hamilton accuses him of being in leadership of that New England secession effort. And Aaron Burr will call him out for a duel. And so he and Alexander Hamilton duel. Hamilton, of course, being accused by Aaron Burr of defaming his character. It's a very controversial event, but what you need to know about the event, the controversy is just this. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton duel with each other. Hamilton will be shot and dies, and Aaron Burr will get away. The story is that Hamilton, or one of the stories is, that Hamilton was a gentleman and he allowed Burr to fire first. Anyway, I don't know what happened, but Hamilton will die a day later from wounds. So that's the end of Alexander Hamilton, right, and the Hamilton program, of the Hamilton program. All right. After that, dueling is illegal in the United States. So Aaron Burr had to leave the northern region. He was in New York, New Jersey area. And after doing that, he went down to the west, down to the mouth of the Mississippi River. And there he would plot one more time with a Governor Wilkinson, James Wilkinson, to cut off part of the United States or part of the Louisiana Territory and build a new nation there. Your book suggests that he had some support from England, or he sought support from England for this particular effort, and that may well be true. He was caught and accused of treason for this. Of course, breaking the United States apart, or plot to break the United States apart, is treasonous. And he would be tried in the John Marshall Supreme Court. And John Marshall ruled that there was not enough evidence to convict him. And so he left for France for some years and then came back and acted as a lawyer again in New York. So that was the end of Aaron Burr. He was never again in U.S. politics, or at least not in any significant way. But I think more what I want to illustrate with Burr's long resume here is that there were plots in the United States to leave by states or groups of states or by individuals. So you want to see that it wasn't all just a smooth course. Elections were heatedly contested, and they were slugfests, and that's a understatement. There were people that wanted to break bits and pieces off and were really testing the federal government in many ways, and Aaron Burr was one of those people. Okay? And this is a picture here of Aaron Burr's and Alexander Hamilton's duel. I'm not sure which one is supposed to be which, but this is a picture from somewhere near the time of what it probably might have looked like as a duel. They do say that the people that went with them did not watch it since it was an illegal event. This picture would belie that, but I'm not sure if the picture's entirely accurate. But that's America at the time of Jefferson's first two administrations. The last thing that Jefferson would face in his administration would be the beginning of the War of 1812, the war that would be the second war for independence for the United States. They